The unexpected encounter. The wind howled across the alien landscape, kicking up clouds of dust that swirled around Ethan as he stood at the edge of the rocky plain. His heart raced, each beat pounding in his chest as the realization of his isolation sank in. The wreckage of his ship lay behind him, a twisted metal carcass partially buried in the sand. There was no one to help him, no immediate way to contact Earth, and no clear path forward. Yet, he couldn't just sit there. His instincts told him to move, to explore, to find something beyond the wreckage that could offer him hope. As Ethan trudged through the barren land, each step seemed to lead him deeper into an unfamiliar and intimidating world. The towering mountains loomed over him, their jagged peaks appearing as though they might collapse at any moment. A faint rumble from the distance sent a shiver down his spine. Thunder, or perhaps the vibrations of some unseen creature moving beneath the surface. But despite the eerie silence that enveloped him, Ethan pressed on. He had no choice. Survival depended on it. Hours passed with nothing but the relentless, unyielding terrain. It felt as though time itself had slowed. The sun above hung in a sickly orange sky, casting a haunting glow on everything around him. Ethan stopped to rest by a small outcropping of rock, pulling out his water flask and taking a long drink. His throat was dry, his skin caked with dust, but he refused to give in to the overwhelming fatigue. There had to be something here, something he could use to survive. That's when he heard it. A faint sound, like a soft cry carried on the wind. At first, he thought it was a trick of his mind, a product of the isolation. But then it came again, louder this time, desperate. His heart skipped a beat as his curiosity overcame the caution that had kept him moving forward for so long. Without hesitation, he rose to his feet, his mind racing with possibilities. Could it be another survivor? Or was it something else, something far more dangerous? Following the sound, Ethan pushed through a dense thicket of alien plants, their long, spiny tendrils reaching out as though they were trying to ensnare him. His heart pounded in his ears as he made his way deeper into the overgrown terrain, each step bringing him closer to the source of the cry. And then, as he rounded a bend, he saw her. She was kneeling in the dirt, her hands bound by thick chains. Her form was graceful, yet she appeared fragile, her pale skin shimmering under the harsh light of the planet's twin suns. Her hair, long and silver, cascaded down her back like liquid moonlight. But it was her eyes that struck Ethan the hardest, eyes that gleamed with intelligence and sorrow, eyes that had seen things no living being should ever have to endure. She was beautiful, but there was a darkness about her, a palpable sadness that seemed to hang in the air around her. At first, she didn't notice him. Her attention was fixed on the chains that bound her wrists, as if she was trying to break free from an invisible force that held her captive. Ethan's first instinct was to run, to turn around and pretend he hadn't seen anything. After all, he was a mere human, a solitary traveler on a strange planet. What business did he have with an alien princess? But something inside him refused to let him walk away. There was something about her, something in the way she carried herself, in the way she looked at him as though she knew he was there even before he made his presence known. "Who are you?" Her voice was soft but commanding, a melody of strange tones that seemed to vibrate in the air around them. Though he didn't understand her language, the urgency in her voice was unmistakable. I'm Ethan," he replied, his voice trembling with both fear and determination. "I don't know how I got here. My ship, it crashed." The princess, who Ethan would later learn was named Tessa, gave him a long, piercing look, her violet eyes studying him as though she were weighing his every word. She then slowly rose to her feet, her chains rattling with the movement. "You are a human?" she asked, her voice tinged with both skepticism and disbelief. "I had not thought your kind ventured this far." Ethan nodded, unsure of what else to say. He could tell by the way she spoke that she was no ordinary alien. There was something regal about her, something otherworldly. Yet, in that moment, standing before her in the desolate wasteland of an unknown planet, she seemed just as vulnerable as he felt. "I'm here to help," Ethan said, his voice steadier now. He stepped closer, his gaze locked on the chains that bound her. What happened to you? Why are you chained up like this? The princess hesitated, as though she were deciding whether or not to trust him. Finally, with a deep breath, she spoke again, this time her voice carrying a sense of both strength and sorrow. I was betrayed. My people, they have forgotten their honor. They sold me to the enemies who seek to claim the throne. Ethan's heart sank as he realized the gravity of her situation. This wasn't just a random encounter, he had stumbled upon someone important, someone whose fate was tied to the very future of the galaxy. But as much as he wanted to help her, he knew that getting her out of here wouldn't be easy. They were not alone on this planet. Whoever had imprisoned her would stop at nothing to ensure that she never escaped. What's your name? Ethan asked, his curiosity growing. Tessa, she said simply, her voice carrying a weight of both power and vulnerability. I am the last heir to the throne of the Iranians. Ethan's mind raced. He had never heard of the Iranians before, but he knew one thing, helping her was no longer a choice, it was a necessity. There was too much at stake. Too many lives, perhaps even entire worlds, depended on her survival. He had to do everything he could to protect her. Then I'm going to get you out of here, he said, determination flooding his words. We'll find a way. Tessa's eyes softened, and for the first time since Ethan had arrived on the planet, a small, hopeful smile tugged at the corner of her lips. She had been lost, imprisoned, and abandoned. But in that moment, Ethan's words brought her a glimmer of hope, something she hadn't felt in a long time. With the humans' help, maybe she could regain what had been taken from her. Together, they would face the unknown, and together, they would discover a bond stronger than any that had existed before, a bond forged through adversity, survival, and a shared will to overcome the impossible. An unlikely alliance. The wind picked up once again, this time carrying with it the scent of something far more dangerous than the usual, sterile dust of the barren land. Tessa's sharp senses detected it first, she froze, her eyes scanning the darkening sky and the dense foliage surrounding them. Ethan, oblivious to the subtle shift in the atmosphere, continued to examine the chains that bound her wrists, trying to find a way to break them. What is it? He asked, sensing the sudden tension in her demeanor. Tessa's voice dropped to a near whisper. We're not alone. They will be coming for me soon. I can feel them. Ethan's pulse quickened. He had seen the brutal-looking guards who had kept Tessa captive, massive, insectoid creatures with glowing eyes and a relentless, predatory nature. If they had found out she was free, there would be no stopping them. He could barely defend himself, let alone protect her from such monstrous beings. But somehow, he couldn't let fear take over. Not now. I won't let them take you, he said, more to himself than to her, though the words were laced with fierce determination. He quickly assessed the landscape, searching for any kind of shelter or cover. His mind raced, coming up with a plan, a desperate, half-formed plan, but a plan nonetheless. Tessa seemed to consider his words for a moment before speaking again. You're not familiar with this place, human. You don't know what we're up against. There was a touch of softness in her voice, but also a firm reminder that the reality of their situation was anything but simple. Ethan turned to her, meeting her gaze with newfound resolve. I may not know your world, but I know survival. And right now, we need to get moving. Can you run? Her lips curled into a small smile, though her eyes remained sharp. I can run faster than you can imagine. But can you keep up, human? Try me, Ethan said, his tone laced with humor, though his hands trembled slightly from the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The two of them moved quickly, darting through the alien landscape, their footsteps muffled by the dense vegetation underfoot. They didn't speak as they ran. There was no time for conversation, only the rhythmic sound of their breathing and the faint rustle of the wind. But with each passing moment, Ethan could feel their bond strengthening, a quiet understanding between them that neither could ignore. This wasn't just an alliance born out of necessity anymore. Something deeper was beginning to take shape, something that neither of them had expected, yet both of them had longed for. Tessa led the way with ease, her alien grace allowing her to navigate the tricky terrain effortlessly. Her sharp eyes scanned their surroundings, always alert for any sign of danger. Ethan, on the other hand, struggled to keep up, his human body not as accustomed to the harsh conditions of this world. But he pushed himself harder, determined to not fall behind. For what felt like hours, they ran, weaving through thick forests of glowing trees, over craggy hills, and across dark, winding ravines. The terrain seemed endless, and every so often, Ethan could feel the weight of his exhaustion creeping in, but he didn't stop. Not when Tessa's life was on the line. He pushed through the pain, the thirst, the hunger. He couldn't afford to be weak. Not now. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Tessa signaled for a halt. They had reached the edge of a large cliff, overlooking a deep valley filled with strange, bioluminescent plants. Ethan's breath came in ragged gasps, but he didn't care. He was too focused on the task ahead. "This is where we make our stand," Tessa said, her voice firm yet oddly calm. "We can't keep running forever. We have to fight back." Ethan nodded, his mind racing. "What's the plan?" Tessa glanced over at him, her eyes glowing with an inner strength he hadn't seen before. "We need to find a place where we can regroup and plan our next move. I know of a hidden sanctuary, not far from here. It's an old temple, built by my ancestors. It's well hidden, and it should give us the time we need." The thought of retreating to an unknown sanctuary both comforted and unnerved Ethan. On the one hand, it was their only option. But on the other, he couldn't help but wonder if they were walking right into a trap. Still, he trusted Tessa. She wasn't just a helpless princess, she was a survivor, like him. They set off again, moving with purpose, their pace quickening as the sounds of pursuit began to grow louder behind them. Ethan could hear the faint hum of alien craft in the distance, searching, hunting. He gritted his teeth and kept his eyes on the path ahead, knowing that their lives depended on getting to that sanctuary. After what seemed like an eternity of running, they arrived at the entrance of the hidden temple. It was an ancient structure, half buried in the earth, its massive stone doors covered in glowing runes that pulsed with an eerie light. Tessa approached the doors, pressing her hand against the stone. For a moment, nothing happened. But then, with a low rumble, the doors slowly began to part, revealing a dark, cool interior. Ethan stepped inside, his senses on high alert. The air inside was thick with the scent of ancient dust and the faint hum of long-forgotten technology. The walls were lined with strange symbols, and in the center of the room stood a pedestal with a glowing orb. Tessa moved towards the orb, her movements reverent, almost as if she were in the presence of something sacred. "This temple is a place of power," she explained softly. "It was built by my ancestors to protect us from enemies. It holds the knowledge and weapons we need to fight back." Ethan felt a surge of hope at her words. For the first time since his crash, he felt as though they might have a chance to survive, if they could use the temple's resources to their advantage. But as Tessa activated the orb, a low, ominous hum filled the air. Something wasn't right. The ground trembled beneath them, and suddenly, the walls of the temple seemed to close in, as though the very earth was trying to swallow them whole. "Get ready," Tessa whispered, her voice steady but tense. "They've found us." Ethan's heart skipped a beat as the distant sound of footsteps grew louder. He had no idea what kind of enemies they were about to face, but one thing was clear, this was only the beginning. The fight for survival, and for the fate of the galaxy, was about to get a lot more dangerous. The awakening of the old powers continued. The low hum of the temple's power core grew louder, echoing through the ancient stone walls as if the very structure was alive, awakening from centuries of slumber. Ethan and Tessa stood at the center of the room, their senses on high alert, as the vibration beneath their feet intensified. The air felt heavy, thick with an energy neither of them fully understood. Tessa's hand hovered over the glowing orb, her fingers brushing its surface, and in that moment, the runes carved into the walls began to shimmer with an ethereal light, pulsing in time with the hum. "This place, it's reacting to you," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. He watched in awe as the glowing symbols danced across the walls, shifting in patterns too intricate for him to comprehend. It was as if the temple itself recognized Tessa's presence, and the old, forgotten powers within it were stirring once more. Tessa's expression was unreadable, her focus fixed entirely on the orb. "It is a part of me," she said, her voice soft but laced with a deep sense of reverence. "This is the heart of my people, the core of our ancient civilization. The Iranians built this place long ago, not just as a sanctuary, but as a repository of our strength. It holds the knowledge and weapons that once made us rulers of the stars." Ethan's mind raced as he tried to absorb the weight of her words. The Iranians, a once great civilization, had been reduced to whispers and legends. But now, in the heart of this hidden temple, it seemed that they were on the verge of something much bigger than either of them had anticipated. If this place truly held the power to turn the tide in their favor, it could mean the difference between life and death. Suddenly, the rumbling beneath them escalated, and the temple doors slammed shut with a deafening crash. The sound of alien boots, metallic and deliberate, echoed from the corridor leading into the heart of the temple. Ethan's hand instinctively went to the blaster he had scavenged from his ship, but Tessa's hand on his arm stopped him. "They're here," Tessa said, her voice tinged with the weight of what was to come. "But they will not be able to breach this place. The temple is ancient, but it is still protected. Only those with the blood of the Iranians can unlock its secrets." Ethan's brow furrowed in confusion. "So, they can't get in?" he asked, his eyes darting to the reinforced stone door, which had no visible locks or mechanisms. "No," Tessa replied, a flicker of hope in her eyes. "But they will try. And they will not stop until they have me. My people, they betrayed me. They've made an enemy of those who were once their allies, and now they have aligned themselves with forces far darker than they realize." As if on cue, the temple shook again, this time more violently, causing dust and debris to rain down from the ceiling. Ethan instinctively ducked, his instincts kicking in as he scanned the room for any signs of entry. But there was no time for panic. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Their only hope now lay in the power of the temple, and in Tessa. "Do you know what we need to do?" Ethan asked, his voice urgent as the footsteps of their enemies grew closer. Tessa's eyes darkened, her features hardening with resolve. "The orb," she said. "The orb holds the key to awakening the weapons we need to defend ourselves. But activating it will take everything I have. It is not a simple task, it requires the blood of an Iranian, and even then, the power it unleashes may be unpredictable." Ethan looked at her, his chest tight with the realization that they were running out of time. "Then let's do it. Whatever it takes." Without another word, Tessa raised her hand and pressed it firmly against the orb. The moment her skin made contact, the light within the orb flared to life, blinding in its intensity. The temple seemed to groan in response, its ancient mechanisms shifting as if awakening from a deep slumber. Ethan shielded his eyes, squinting against the sudden brightness as the energy in the room began to pulse in waves. The air crackled with raw power, and the walls seemed to hum with an ancient force that reverberated through his very bones. Tessa's face was etched with concentration as she poured every ounce of her energy into the orb, her breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. Sweat beaded on her forehead, and her eyes burned with a fierce determination that Ethan had never seen before. The power within the orb was immense, and it seemed to feed off her strength, growing ever more volatile as she tried to harness it. "Stay back," she warned, her voice strained. "The power will be unleashed soon. It's too dangerous." Ethan didn't move. He couldn't. He had seen enough to understand the magnitude of what was happening. This was not just about saving Tessa anymore, it was about saving them both, about using the temple's power to turn the tables on their enemies. And as the glowing orb pulsed violently, Ethan knew they had no choice but to trust in the ancient powers that Tessa was awakening. Suddenly, with a deafening roar, the orb exploded in a burst of radiant energy. The entire temple trembled, and for a moment everything was bathed in blinding white light. Ethan could feel his body being pulled toward the source of the energy, as if some invisible force was trying to tear him apart. But he held firm, his eyes locked on Tessa as she struggled to maintain control. The light slowly faded, and the room fell into an eerie silence. Ethan blinked, trying to clear his vision, and when the afterglow finally subsided, he saw something that took his breath away. The orb had transformed. What had once been a glowing sphere was now a massive, intricate weapon, its surface covered in glowing runes that matched the ones on the walls of the temple. It pulsed with raw energy, its power radiating from every inch of its form. Tessa stood before it, her body trembling with exhaustion, but her eyes were filled with something new, hope. She had done it. The weapon was theirs. "We have a chance now," she said, her voice filled with awe. "The weapon is bound to me, and through it, I can command the forces of my people. We can fight back." But before Ethan could respond, the temple doors shuddered under the weight of the assault outside. They were running out of time. Their enemies were almost at the door, and the moment of truth had arrived. Would the weapon be enough to defend them? Tessa turned to Ethan, her expression resolute. "We fight now. Together." Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of their future in that single moment. He wasn't just a human anymore. He wasn't just an outsider on a strange world. He was part of something bigger, part of a struggle that transcended his own survival. And together with Tessa, they would face whatever was coming, no matter how impossible it seemed, the battle unleashed. The air outside the temple was thick with tension. The ground rumbled beneath their feet as the distant sound of heavy footsteps echoed closer, growing louder with each passing moment. Ethan stood next to Tessa, watching the dark shadows of their enemies approach through the ancient stone windows. There was no turning back now. The weapon was activated, its power now at their disposal, but would it be enough to fend off the forces coming for them? Tessa's face was a mask of determination, her eyes focused and intense. The weapon, now fully charged, hummed with energy at her side, but she could feel the weight of responsibility pressing on her shoulders. This was not just about her survival anymore, it was about saving a people, restoring a legacy, and stopping the relentless war that had torn apart her home. The Iranians had once been the rulers of vast swaths of the galaxy, but now, after years of exile and betrayal, they were scattered and broken. But with this weapon, with the power she had just unleashed, they could turn the tide. "We don't have much time," Ethan said, breaking the silence. His voice was low but steady, betraying none of the anxiety he felt. He'd been in his fair share of battles before, but this was different. This wasn't just a fight for survival, it was a fight to protect everything that mattered. Tessa nodded, gripping the weapon tightly. "They'll come at us with everything they have. But this weapon, it's more than just a tool. It's a conduit, a bridge between the ancient powers of the Iranians and the future we want to build. We must be ready." Ethan could see the flicker of fear in her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by the cold resolve of a leader who had no choice but to fight. She was no longer just a princess or a fugitive, she was a force of nature, a beacon of hope for her people. And though he had no idea what he was about to face, he was more determined than ever to fight alongside her. "Let's make sure they regret coming here," he said, his voice filled with a newfound conviction. The temple doors trembled under the assault of their enemies, but they held strong, for now. The power of the weapon surged as Tessa's will flowed through it. She closed her eyes for a moment, concentrating, focusing on the energy that hummed through her veins. The weapon was a reflection of her spirit, her connection to her people, and it responded to her emotions. In this moment, it was more than just an object, it was an extension of her very being. Outside, the enemy forces were growing closer, their voices a low murmur as they prepared to breach the temple's defenses. They were relentless, but Tessa knew that if they could just hold the line long enough, they could win. The temple was ancient, its walls reinforced with long-lost technology that was beyond their enemies' understanding. But even that wouldn't be enough if they didn't act fast. Suddenly, the doors exploded open, sending a shockwave through the room. Ethan barely had time to react before a group of heavily armed alien soldiers stormed in, their weapons drawn and their eyes glowing with malice. They were a coalition of mercenaries and rogue factions, hired by the powerful warlords who had sided with the Iranian traitors. They had one goal, capture Tessa, and with her, the weapon. Ethan's heart raced as the soldiers advanced, their alien forms towering over him. Their bodies were armored in sleek, metallic exoskeletons, and their faces were hidden behind dark visors. The sound of their weapons charging sent a chill through the air. Tessa stepped forward, her eyes blazing with an unyielding fire. The weapon at her side began to glow brighter, its power responding to her resolve. "They've come for you, Tessa," one of the soldiers growled, his voice distorted through his helmet. "Surrender, and we'll make it quick. Resist, and we'll make you wish you hadn't." Tessa didn't flinch. She stood her ground, her voice clear and steady. "I will never surrender. This is my world. You have no place here." In a flash, the weapon was raised, its energy pulsing violently as Tessa unleashed its full force. The air crackled with power, and the ground beneath their feet cracked open, as if the temple itself was reacting to the weapon's energy. The soldiers staggered back, their armor unable to withstand the onslaught. The first blast from the weapon sent one of the soldiers flying across the room, his body crashing against the stone wall with a sickening thud. Ethan couldn't believe his eyes. The power emanating from the weapon was like nothing he had ever seen. It wasn't just destructive, it was beautiful, a pure manifestation of energy and intent. And Tessa was the conduit, the one guiding its power to protect them all. But their enemies weren't backing down. The remaining soldiers opened fire, their weapons flashing with deadly intent. Ethan ducked behind a column, his heart racing as blasts of energy tore through the air. He could hear the sizzling sound of plasma bolts ricocheting off the walls. The fight was on, and they were outnumbered. Tessa's face was pale with the strain of controlling the weapon, but her resolve never wavered. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for a future, for the Iranians, for their people, and for the galaxy. Each blast from the weapon sent shockwaves through the room, but she knew she couldn't sustain this kind of power for long. The strain on her body was immense, but there was no other choice. "Ethan," she shouted, her voice filled with urgency. "We need to break through their lines. We can't stay here." Ethan nodded, understanding what she meant. They needed to make their way to the heart of the temple, where the power could be fully harnessed. But the soldiers were closing in, and the odds were stacked against them. "We don't have a choice," Ethan said, his voice resolute. He picked up a fallen soldier's weapon, a sleek energy rifle, and began firing at the approaching enemies. The shots were precise, each blast disabling a soldier's armor and sending them tumbling to the ground. Tessa, with the weapon still in her hand, followed his lead, unleashing another wave of energy that sent a group of soldiers sprawling. The power of the temple was now fully awakened, and with it, their enemies were quickly realizing that they had underestimated the true potential of the Iranian weapon. But even as the battle raged on, Ethan knew they couldn't hold out forever. They needed to move quickly if they were going to survive. With a final, desperate push, they made their way through the temple's inner halls, their steps echoing through the corridors. The energy from the weapon lit their way, but they could feel the weight of the battle pressing down on them. The enemy was relentless, and they would stop at nothing to capture Tessa.